I recently got the Nikon Z5 and I want to put through a couple of tests to see how it performs in low light. So I took some test photos all the way from ISO 100 to ISO 51200 to see exactly how much grain would be added and at what point would these photos become unusable. So in this video, I'm going to run you through those test images, and I'm also going to show you various photographs that I've taken with the Nikon Z5 at various ISOs so you get a good idea for how much grain you can expect. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to start this off with the test images that I took. I took the Nikon Z5, placed it down on my desk, and started taking photographs of my 50mm 1.8 attached to my FTZ adapter. This first photo we're looking at is at ISO 100. So let's zoom in. You can see there's no grain. It's very sharp. It's a good photo. Overall, ISO 100 is performing exactly how you would expect it to. So let's move on up. This is going to be ISO 200. Again, no grain. ISO 200 still behaving very well in the low light. Moving back up, ISO 400. 400, still not seeing any real grain, no loss of quality. ISO 800, not any grain that I could really see at ISO 800. It's still looking pretty good. This is really good because ISO 800 is a good ISO to be at for shooting indoors. Now ISO 1600, this is when I get the first glimpse of seeing any grain. If you look right on the sides here, right where the shadows get a little light, you see a tiny bit of grain. Again, completely usable photos out of ISO 1600. ISO 3200 is where the grain actually starts to become very noticeable. So I'll move to another part of this photograph here. I'm going to look down at my little headphone holder here. You'll start to see it gets a little grainy, especially in a blurred background. So at ISO 100, it is tack sharp for the most part. Across that line, it has a nice background blur, not a lot of grain. But if you go up to ISO 3200, now we start to see some of that grain start to set in. All right, so let's go back, zoom in here again. Let's go to ISO 6400. Now the grain starts to become noticeable. You can start seeing it in the blacks. There's a lot of noise going on, and you could still use this image. It's still sharp, it's still on point, but now you're going to start getting that grain. Now we're bumping up to ISO 12800. This is when we're starting to see a lot of grain, but not much quality loss. The photo itself is still in focus and it's still sharp, but you're starting to see that grain even when you zoom out of the photo. Move up to ISO 25600. This is when we start to lose quality. At 25600, there is a noticeable quality loss. Little bits of the smaller edges, especially where it says AFS, Nik or 50mm, are starting to get chopped up by that noise a little bit. And the rest of the image is also getting extremely grainy around where the shadows meet the highlights and the midtones. Let me bring back over here. This little background blur here is extremely noisy, very grainy, not too great at ISO 25600. And we're going to top it off with ISO 51200. This is the highest you could usually go on this camera. You could push it a little further, but this is the highest default setting. Now at ISO 51200, which is double what we did last, there is a noticeable loss in quality, a complete loss of image quality where everything is pretty much just noise. I've never shot this high out in a real-world situation, but I can only imagine the photo would not be usable. So let's do some real-world examples here. This is a portrait photo I took. It was indoors, lit by a couple of newer 660 LED lights. If you're looking for a good lighting setup, I'll put that link in the description as well. Great lights. They work very well. Now, this lighting setup, it's not as bright as using a strobe, so I had to use ISO 400 on this. But as you can see, there's no grain. Everything is tack sharp. Everything looks really nice and crisp. No noise, nothing really going against any kind of quality here. The photo looks wonderful at ISO 400. This other photo I took, I was in the woods, took a photo of a white-tailed deer. This shot was taken at ISO 1000. Now ISO 1000 is kind of where I like to stay while I'm in low light outside in the woods, mainly because there's a lot of tree cover out there. There's not a lot of natural light, especially if I'm out there early in the morning. So I kind of have to bump the ISO up just to get a sharp shot because these animals are moving, they're not staying still. So you can see a little bit of grain, especially on the small hairs here, merging in with the background, a lot of noise coming in, but at the same time, it's still very good against the background. You can still make out the image. There is no noticeable quality loss at ISO 1000. And this final image I'm going to show you is probably the highest I've shot out in the woods, so I don't like to go higher. This is at ISO 1600. Now, this is a far shot for a 300mm lens. The deer was pretty far away from me, but you could see there's a little bit of motion blur because there's a little more focus back here by the deer's tail, but you could see a lot of that grain in the background and the foreground elements where it's starting to get really noisy and you're losing a little color and quality loss. So the small details in the distance are really being lost. due to shooting at a higher ISO. But at the same time, again, with a little bit of noise reduction and some sharpening, this image is completely usable at ISO 1600. So even shooting at a very low light when you're bumping up your ISO, I would be comfortable in bringing my ISO up to at least 3200 while out in the field and not worrying too much about the quality loss. Overall, I'm really impressed with how the Nikon Z5 performs in low light. The grain really does not start to set in until you hit above ISO 3200, and even at ISO 6400, you still have a very usable image. If you're looking to buy the Nikon Z5, I highly recommend it. You can check out the entire spec sheet and all the information about the Nikon Z5 in the description below. If you want to see some more photographs that I've taken with the Nikon Z5, check out my Instagram. It's @dom.iwc. That link will be below as well. Otherwise, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.